Hi, everybody. So we are talking about circulation and gas exchange. This is chapter 42 in your book. This is a picture of a type of salamander called an axolotl. And one reason why I'm showing you this picture is because you can see sort of the two systems that we're working with. Circulation, which is like our cardiovascular system, our blood and heart and veins and arteries and all that, and our gas exchange system, which is like respiration and breathing. So this axolotl is a type of salamander and has these external gills. The gills are what it uses for gas exchange or breathing. It's an aquatic organism, so it uses these for breathing, but you can see that they're really pink. That means that they have a lot of blood vessels in there, and the gas exchange is occurring between those blood vessels and the water. So the reason these two systems, circulatory system and respiratory system, are together in the same chapter is because they are closely tied. And we will see that as we go through this lecture. Okay, so as I mentioned in the emails and in class on Wednesday, this chapter is pretty intense. There's a lot of different topics. This outline makes it sound maybe even more intense than it actually is, but I just wanted to make sure I was listing most of the topics so you can kind of see where we're going and how they're organized. So the first video that I'm going to do for you is an introduction to exchange systems in general, and then we're going to start with the circulatory system. And we'll go through a lot of general information about different circulatory systems depending on different organisms. Talk about some general information about vessels, different types of vessels, and about the heart. So this first part is going to be kind of long, but I want to get it all out of the way before we start talking about mammalian circulation or the circulatory system, which is going to be more related to humans, as you'll see. Okay, so before we actually talk about exchange systems and about the circulatory system, it's important that we remember that cells in our bodies and all organisms' bodies have to exchange substances with their environment. So we've already talked about this in plants some, and a lot of what we talked about in plants was the exchange of water between cells through osmosis. And remember, water tends to move to areas with higher concentrations of solutes and through osmosis. And diffusion, we didn't talk about diffusion very much in this class, but I know you talked about it some in Cellular, which you took last semester. But diffusion is going to be the focus in terms of material exchange in this chapter. And I'm just going to give you a little review of it here.
Diffusion is the tendency for particles of any kind to spread out from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This process can also be described as molecules moving down their concentration gradient. Diffusion across a biological membrane is called passive transport, since the cell expends no energy to move the molecules. Oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules move into and out of cells by passive transport.
Okay, so as this implied, what we're really going to be spending most time talking about, it's actually near the end of the chapter, is the movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen across membranes. Okay, so that's the diffusion we're going to be talking about when we actually get to the exchange between cells. Okay, so now we're going to focus a little bit on the different types of exchange systems that organisms have. And remember, the exchange system is really, it's sort of a combination of the circulatory system and the respiratory system. So we're not really talking about either one specifically yet. So exchange systems, again, they're really necessary so that every cell in every organism can get the material that it needs and can get rid of the materials it needs to get rid of. So in some animals, if the cells are in direct contact with the environment, then there's no circulatory system at all. Organisms with gastrovascular cavities, you may remember these from when we talked about animal nutrition. Organisms with gastrovascular cavities basically do not have a circulatory system in the same way that we do. So the gastrovascular cavity actually functions both in digestion, like we learned about in the last chapter, and distribution of other substances like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Some species that have gastrovascular cavities are cnidarians, and that would include jellyfish, sea anemones, and this hydra. We saw the hydra consuming a daphnia in the last chapter. And then flatworms like this, and lots of other invertebrates as well. But you can see this flatworm right here. Here's a mouth, and then this gastrovascular cavity is actually pretty extensive, and it's got a lot of projections, so it's large. But if you look, you can see that it sort of branches into cell or close to cells that are all over the body. The body wall of the gastrovascular cavity is only 2 cells thick, which means that any substances that get into the gastrovascular cavity, like even if it's just water, the water from the gastrovascular cavity can get very close to all of the cells in the body, whether you're talking about a hydra or you're talking about a flatworm. And because of that, materials can diffuse across the cell membranes, and you don't need a circulatory system to move substances around the body. So gastrovascular cavities really keep simple body plan organisms from requiring a circulatory system. Complex organisms, though, do have specialized exchange systems. And for most organisms, direct exchange between the cells and the environment is not possible like it is in organisms with the gastrovascular cavity. So most organisms are, or most multicellular organisms anyways, are considered complex organisms, and they would require a more advanced specialized exchange system. In this case, we're talking about the circulatory system and the gas exchange system being closely tied for these complex organisms. One example of a specialized exchange system in animals is gills, and I talked about this very briefly before on that first slide. And essentially, this is the same picture, or at least the same organism. These are gills that are on an aquatic organism, the axolotl, or it's a type of salamander. And oxygen can diffuse from the water into the blood vessels that are found within the gills. And then that oxygenated blood is going to travel through the rest of the body and help the cells get oxygen when they are low in oxygen. In the same way, in these gills, we have blood that needs to get rid of carbon dioxide, and so the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the gills into the water. So you've got this exchange system between the respiratory surface, which is the gills, and the capillaries of the blood vessels exchanging materials with the water. Okay, so now we're going to talk specifically about the circulatory system, and we're going to leave the respiratory system for the end. So the circulatory system has a lot of jobs. It's not just to bring oxygen from the respiratory surface, like for example the lungs, to the rest of the body, and it's not just about getting rid of carbon dioxide. The circulatory system has to circulate the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also nutrients, wastes, hormones, antibodies, and all kinds of other materials, and even heat to different areas of the body that need them. So the circulatory system has lots of different functions. It's not just about moving oxygen and carbon dioxide around. As you can see down here, the circulatory system is responsible for it attaches with the GI tract, and so the food that you eat, again, based on the lecture we had last week, the food that you eat, the nutrients from the food get absorbed into the circulatory system, and then those materials also will move around the body so that the cells that need energy can get the nutrients from the food. And we could talk about each of these different sections, but we haven't discussed kidney function yet, and we haven't discussed some of these other things. So just wanted to draw your attention to the digestive tract and the way that the circulatory system is utilized by that. Okay, so the main components of the circulatory system are a muscular pump, which is typically called the heart, a circulatory fluid, which for most, or for many species, at least the ones you're familiar with, is blood, and a set of interconnecting vessels, for example, veins and arteries. So if we go back to the heart, we can see that typically we think of an organism having only one heart, but some organisms can have multiple hearts. Okay, so this is an earthworm, and you can see it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hearts. These are all have the same function, but they have 5 and we have 1. The heart always pumps in a singular direction. So the heart controls the flow of the blood, and it's always flowing one way. As long as there's a circulatory system in place, the heart, or whatever this muscular pump is going to pump the blood in a single direction. Obviously, in this case, we have a very simple heart. Even though there's 5 of them, they have a very simple structure, while our heart, right here, human heart, is much more complex. Okay, we're going to talk more about blood later. Here's a set of interconnecting vessels, veins and arteries. Veins and arteries are the main vessels that we're going to talk about for the rest of the lecture, but you'll see that there are some additional ones. But in general, the vessels are going to take the blood that's being pumped from the heart to the rest of the tissues, and depending on what needs to be accomplished, that will actually determine which tissues the blood is being pumped to, but it's always being pumped through vessels. And within these veins and arteries, or especially veins, there's going to be valves that keep blood flowing in the correct direction, but we're going to get into those details later. So there are actually 2 different sort of categories of circulatory systems: open circulatory systems and closed circulatory systems. You're probably much more familiar with a closed circulatory system because that's what vertebrates, mammals, have. But there's also open circulatory systems. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I just want you to know the difference. So open circulatory systems are found in some invertebrates, like insects and some mollusks. And what this is, it still has a tubular heart, which is, in this case, if we're looking at this grasshopper, the heart is still sort of similarly shaped as it was in the earthworm. You can see that there's a lot of different segments to it, but the heart has these pores in it that are called ostia. Animals with an open circulatory system don't have blood. They have something called hemolymph. And the hemolymph, there are some vessels, but the hemolymph is not contained within the vessels at all times like it is in a closed circulatory system. So it spends some time in the vessels, but then the rest of the time the hemolymph is sort of surrounding all of the organs of the body. So all of the cell tissues, all of the tissues are being bathed in this hemolymph at all times. So that's why it's called an open circulatory system, because the fluid, the circulatory fluid, is not fully enclosed within vessels. Closed circulatory system is what we're most familiar with and what we're going to spend the rest of the time on. But it's not just vertebrates who have closed circulatory systems. So closed circulatory system, again, this is when the blood is entirely enclosed within vessels the whole time. It's found in earthworms. It's found in cephalopods, like octopi and squid, and it's found in vertebrates. Again, the closed circulatory system has blood and not hemolymph, and it's confined to vessels. So here you have sort of a difference between the open circulatory system and the closed. Here you have the heart. It's still pumping the hemolymph in a single direction, which is this way. But then the hemolymph opens up into the interstitial fluid, and it's basically just all around inside the body, and it's not contained within vessels. In our body, we have, again, the heart that's pumping the blood in a particular direction, but unless there's an injury to a vessel, the blood remains inside vessels at all times. So like when you cut your finger, basically you're breaking the vessels open, and so that's why it bleeds. The vessels are being split, and so the blood is just flowing out of them, but typically inside your body, it's all contained within vessels. So if we go specifically to vertebrate circulatory systems, we call vertebrate circulatory systems the cardiovascular system. It's a closed circulatory system called the cardiovascular system. And there are three main types of blood vessels. I mentioned before that there were different blood vessels, and I said the two main ones were arteries and veins, but you can't forget capillaries, because capillaries are going to become really important. They are actually the place where all of the exchange occurs. So we have arteries, veins, and capillaries. As I mentioned before, blood flow is always in one direction. The heart is pumping the blood in a particular direction, so you could follow this all the way around, and you can see that it never changes direction. All goes in one direction the whole way. And one thing that I'm going to reiterate over and over is that if you're trying to remember the difference between arteries and veins, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So artery away, they both start with A. And veins are going to carry blood back to the heart. You may have some kind of idea that arteries always have oxygen in them, high oxygen, and veins always have low oxygen, but that is not accurate. So it's better to remember arteries as going away from the heart and veins as going towards the heart. Okay, so we have arteries and veins, but it's also important to know that arteries, when they move through the body, they are going to branch into smaller arteries called arterioles. And arterioles are going to branch into capillaries. So arteries are going to be carrying blood, and they're going to be branching and branching and branching into arterioles. And when the arterioles branch into different regions of the body, they branch into capillaries. Okay, so here's an example. This is not showing the artery, it's just showing the arteriole. So you can vision like a larger vessel over here branching, and here's one branch, arteriole, and here's another branch that's branching into the capillaries. The capillary beds are the sites of chemical exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid, or basically in between cells that are nearby these capillary beds. Okay, and the exchange has to go through the interstitial fluid between cells. But on the other side of the capillary bed from the arteriole, if you move through the capillary bed, you end up finding a venule. A venule is a small branch of a vein, and eventually that blood is going to move from a venule into the larger vein. So the venules converge into veins, and they're going to return the blood from the capillaries to the heart. All vertebrate hearts contain 2 or more chambers. You're probably familiar with human hearts having 4 chambers, but they don't all have 4 chambers. Some of them have 2, some of them have 3, and some of them have 4. Either way, the two types of chambers are the atrium and the ventricle. So no matter how many heart chambers you have as a vertebrate, blood is always going to enter through the atrium. and the blood is always going to be pumped out through the ventricle. So I'm going to show you real quick just how this works. We're going to go over some of these in more detail in a second. But here you have blood. This is a fish heart, and basically the circulatory system of the fish. You have the blood coming into the atrium and leaving the ventricle. Here you have an amphibian. The blood is coming into the atrium, labeled with the A, and then being pumped out through the ventricle, etc. Okay, so we're going to talk about the difference between single circulation and double circulation. Single circulation is more simple. Let me move this so you can see the arrows and everything. And it is basically the, I'm not sure if it occurs in any other thing but fishes. So fishes don't have lungs, but they do have gills. Bony fishes, rays, and sharks have a single circulation with two-chambered heart, sort of like in the image I was showing you before. Here's the two-chambered heart, here is the atrium, and here's the ventricle, and the blood's going to be pumped out of the ventricle. In a single circulation system, the blood leaves the heart, and then it ends up having to pass through two different capillary beds. The first, before it returns to the heart. So the first capillary bed is going to be in the gills. Remember, the gills are where the blood is going to gain oxygen. It's going to release carbon dioxide and going to gain oxygen from the water. So it's kind of like utilized in a similar way as lungs would be. And then once the blood is oxygenated, that blood has to go to all of the different body tissues. Okay? The body tissues need the oxygenated blood. All the cells need to get blood. So it's got to pass through another capillary bed somewhere, and so that it can deliver the oxygen to the different cells. And so by the time it gets through the second capillary bed, and it needs to get pumped back to the heart, the blood pressure is really, really, really low. So it's pretty hard for the fish to pump its blood in this circuit, since it has to go through two capillary beds before blood can return to the heart. Double circulation takes care of that problem because the blood only has to pass through one capillary bed before returning to the heart, no matter what's happening. So amphibians, reptiles, and mammals all have double circulation. The two different circuits are the pulmonary circuit, which goes to the lungs, and the systemic circuit, which goes to any part of the body that needs oxygenated blood, basically. So how this works is oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood they're pumped separately from the right and the left sides of the heart. So here's the right side of the heart. This one is dealing with oxygen poor blood. That's what the blue is representing. Here is the left side of the heart. And I know when you're looking at it, it looks like the right side, but the way when you're looking at these, it's as if this thing was lying on its back. So you have to think of it as opposite. So this is the left side of the heart, and the left side is dealing with the oxygen-rich blood. The oxygen-poor blood gets pumped to the lungs. Okay, so here's the oxygen-poor blood. This is in the pulmonary circuit. It gets pumped to the lungs, and then it gets oxygenated and returns to the heart. That's the whole pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit occurs out of the left side of the heart, and you've got oxygen-rich blood, which leaves the heart and gets pumped to the rest of the body, any of the places that need oxygen-rich blood, so that in these capillary beds, it can exchange the oxygen-rich blood with the cells that need it. And then at the end of that, the oxygen-poor blood will come back to the heart to finish the systemic circuit. Because there's double circulation in this, because there's double circulation in these vertebrates, besides fish, then there's higher blood pressure, and it's a lot easier for the blood to get back to the heart than if the blood were to pass through two capillary beds before getting back to the heart. Okay, so we're just going to run through this part really quick. The details aren't very important, but depending on which vertebrate you are, it influences how many chambers you have in your heart. So mammals, birds, and some reptiles, in particular crocodilians, have 4 separate chambers. So their hearts all look very similar, with 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood never come in contact with one another. They're fully separated. However, most reptiles besides the crocodilians have 3 chambers with a partially separated ventricle. So that would look like this. So here is mammals and birds and crocodilians, where you see the ventricles are completely separated from each other. And here you see that they're not separated from each other. So there's a little bit of mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenating blood. In amphibians, they also have 3 chambers, 2 atria and a ventricle. But whereas in reptilians, there was a septum that was sort of dividing this a little bit, no such septum appears at all in the amphibian heart. And so you have 3 chambers with no division in the ventricle. 2 atria, 1 ventricle, and there's a lot of mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood within the heart. Another interesting thing about amphibians is that they do some gas exchange. They have lungs. Most of them have lungs or gills, but they also do gas exchange through their skin. So they have this pulmocutaneous circuit. All that means is that they have capillary beds within the lungs, and they have capillary beds with close to the skin. And so there's a few different ways that they can have gas exchange. Don't need to worry about it any more than the fact that they can use their skin as a respiratory surface as well as their lungs. And it's called the pulmocutaneous circuit instead of the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so this just kind of summarizes what we've already talked about to put it all in one place. If we're talking about single and double circulation, we start with the fish that had the single circulation and a 2-chambered heart, 1 atrium and 1 ventricle. In single circulation, the blood goes through 2 capillary beds. After it gets pumped out of the heart, goes to 2 capillary beds before returning to the heart. In terms of animals with double circulation, that means they have 2 different circuits, a pulmonary circuit, which goes to the respiratory surface, typically the lungs, and the systemic circuit, which is the circuit that goes to the rest of the body and basically feeds the rest of the body the oxygenated blood. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, 2 atria and 1 ventricle. They breathe with lungs and skin, and they have a pulmocutaneous circuit and a systemic circuit. Those are their 2 circuits. Turtles, snakes, and lizards have a 3-chambered heart as well, 2 atria and 1 ventricle, but that ventricle is partially divided by an incomplete septum, so there's less mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood than an amphibian. So here's the amphibian heart, here's the reptilian heart. Mammals, birds, and crocodilians, all of them have a 4-chambered heart with 2 atria, 2 ventricles, and there's no mixing of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. So those are down here. The left side of the heart pumps and receives only oxygen-rich blood, while the right side receives and pumps only oxygen-poor blood. And the reason why mammals and birds don't have the separation, they do have the separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, is probably because they are endotherms. They require more oxygen than ectotherms, so the full separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood makes their circulatory system more efficient and better able to get oxygenated blood to the cells that need it. Okay, I know that was really long, so none of the other videos are going to be that long, and some of the other ones are going to be really short. So thanks for hanging in there with me.